Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I am excited for our next session here. And I do want to mention something right off the bat. I got a chance to see Daylan, who's our next speaker here. She's going to be doing a session called Empathy in Action Enhancing Call Takers' Response in Domestic Violence Calls. And the most recent ranch that I was at, out in Texas for the 360 dispatcher, we were out there for the leadership event, and I'm there all week, like to be there to get to know everyone and stuff. I'm one of the regular instructors, and it was the first time that I got to see her present. And partially through, it was like, holy moly, I need to have her as part of Dare to Be Great. And I look over at Joe a little bit later and it's like, dude, is it okay if I ask you, you think it'd be cool? And he goes, Are you are you trying to steal my speakers or what? And I was like, what? And I said, come on now, guy. It's like, no, it's not like that. And he's
Oh,
like, I'm just joking with you. And I was like, I know you're busting balls. It wouldn't be Joe if he wasn't busting some balls. So
exactly.
yes, so it was awesome to see you there. It's awesome to have you here, and I'm excited for everyone to check out your presentation. So without further ado, please, my friend, take it away.
Thank you, Ricardo. Hey, y'all. I'm so excited to be here today talking about empathy in action. Um, let's go ahead and just jump right in. I want to give y'all a trigger warning. I added this slide. I've never had this slide up here in my presentation before, but I feel like on a virtual stage is probably the most courteous way of letting y'all know that what we're going to talk about is some really sensitive and kind of effed up information. So I just want to let you know if you've ever been involved in domestic violence, if you've ever witnessed domestic violence, if you've ever taken a call of domestic violence and it's affected you emotionally, this may trigger some situations that you have experienced in the past and some trauma. I will not be offended if you need to leave the session or walk away. And I just want to let you know that I'm okay. I just wanted to give everyone's a heads up. So after that, now we're going to go into an amazing story. So I want you to just try to imagine for a moment. You start seeing this person and they're your new partner. You're considering a relationship with them, and you get flattering and compliments. They're showering you with gifts. There's phone calls all the time. You feel seen. You feel heard. You're so enamored in this situation. You feel like the people in this picture, just totally in love. You start planning and talking about the future. You go on dates. You definitely have some serious chemistry and you start doing new experiences together. You're sharing stories. You're being vulnerable with this person. You actually feel really important in this person's life. So you end up moving in together. Now you're not married, and it's probably not the smartest idea, but you are so in love with this person. It just makes so much sense. So just kind of like feel that love and that excitement. I know that most people in this presentation will have experienced this at some point. And so I feel like we can all relate to how amazing this feels. When we go through, I just realized my radio is still on and I'm going to turn it off. I'm listening to my radio. So hang on one second. Oh my goodness. You know, dispatch life. So when you have that lovely, warm, exciting feeling, and that quickly after you move in turns into manipulation, false accusations of cheating on the person that you are so in love with. They start to isolate you. They tell you that your friends are not really your friends and that they just want to take advantage of you somehow, and that your family doesn't really care about you, etc., etc. Then all of those things turn into threats. When you start to realize, like, hey, this isn't really healthy behavior in a relationship. I'm not sure if I am okay here. and you start to pull away a bit, well, then they threaten to leave, and they threaten to make your experience at home so much harder because they want to be in this relationship with you so that they can control you. They control you financially, they intimidate you. And ultimately, you start to lose yourself. Then you get into a situation where you're trying to just live your best life and cope and manage, and they start trying to sexually coerce you into things that you don't want to do, ultimately leading to rape, which resulted in pregnancy. At that point, you start having panic attacks because you're like, oh my gosh, I'm pregnant, I'm stuck with this person, and how did I even get here? Then the arguments and the relationship escalate into screaming, shoving, and scratching. There's a lot of really hard words on that screen, so I'm going to remove it. But Ricardo is going to put up a poll, and I want to know if, as dispatchers or anyone who's joined us today, have you ever heard something like this before? So if you go to the right-hand side and click on polls, you can cast your vote and click yes or no if you have or haven't heard things like that before. I see we already have some votes coming in, and the majority are saying yes, they have heard things like that before. Um, Mainly in the dispatch center, it is something that we don't consider as being domestic violence when you start talking about specific elements of that. But this story is my story. And I know that for those of you who know me and haven't heard this part of my story before, it's kind of hard to believe that I had been through so many things like that. But there's a reason why I'm doing this. There's a reason why I'm sharing this story, even though it's super hard to share. And it's because my personal mission in life is to love God, love people, and speak truth. That's a beautiful picture of my amazing daughter, which was the result of that pregnancy. She is my number one biggest fan in life, and I am her number one biggest fan in life. And I knew that God had a purpose for all of these things, and I would not change anything about my current circumstances. So, the purpose of empathy in action is to educate dispatchers and industry leaders about the elements of family violence, the lifelong impacts of violence on children, the generational cycle of abuse, reasons why victims stay or return to their abusers, stigmas in public safety related to domestic violence, and how we can help people who are experiencing domestic violence. And I just want to preamble by saying we can help callers who are experiencing domestic violence, but during this presentation, I'm going to explain how you can also recognize in your employees and your coworkers if this might be happening to them. I was a 911 dispatcher when I was experiencing a domestic violence situation, and I never called the police. I never told anyone at work, and I suffered on my own in solitude because there's a lot of reasons, and you'll learn why a little bit more as we go through the presentation. So, brain bump. If you have the workbook, it's going to be page 3 of the workbook. But I want y'all to find a really important reason, or a reason to make this important to you. If you're a call taker, why do you want to learn about empathy in action? And if you're brave, you can share your why in the comments with everybody, but you don't need to. It's not an obligation. You could also just write it down in the workbook. But if you write it down if you haven't gotten the workbook and you don't want to put it in the comments, find a quick little piece of paper and type it down or write it down somewhere as to why this is so important for you. I'll tell you, it's important for me because of that little girl right there on the screen holding the 911 phone. And you see the red 911 phone in the back. She is the reason why this is so important to me. I don't want her to ever have to experience what I experienced in life. No one's brave enough to share. That's okay. All right, so now we're going to talk about the elements of family violence in the state of Texas. Okay, I don't have I have no federal knowledge about elements of family violence, but I do know in the state of Texas that there are some very specific elements. So the first element is going to be the harm or the threat of harm of bodily injury, assault, or sexual assault. It's very straightforward. The really important part that I think that we forget as 911 dispatchers is the threat of harm in this circumstance. And of course, I know there are a lot of viewers outside of the state of Texas. And I just want to encourage you, if you're concerned or you're not sure about what the elements of family violence are in your state, go to the state statutes and look up family violence or domestic violence elements in case law and read about it. The second element is abuse. Typically, abuse applies to the vulnerable, so disabled parties, children, elderly, and things like that. Also, we have dating violence. So the third element is dating violence. So as we move forward through this presentation, I just want you to keep in mind those three elements as we are talking about how this applies to our job. So I pulled a lot of statistics and I want to go over the impacts of domestic violence on children. The elements of family violence in the workbook was on page 4, and now we're on page 5. I really don't know if this workbook is helpful. I just made it, and I think maybe it will be helpful. So if you guys find the workbook helpful, let me know. If not, and you're like, it's a piece of crap and no one's using it, please tell me so that I don't go through the effort next time to make a workbook. Um, so, and I mean, if Ricardo's listening and would like to make a poll that asks, is the workbook helpful? Yes or no, would be helpful too. We'll see if he's able to do that. Thank you, Ricardo. I appreciate your compliment. So let's kind of talk about what the impacts of domestic violence are on children. So I can speak from my own experience, but I didn't want to only speak from my own experience. So I added some links and I did pull this information from professional sources. So children who are in homes that have domestic violence have a greater risk for entering into relationships that are abusive or becoming abusers themselves. They also are at a serious risk for long-term physical and mental health problems. What do I mean by physical? I mean that when children, and what does the article mean by physical, right? When children experience a home and they're raised up in an environment with domestic violence, they start to have physical responses to trauma. That is the fight or flight response. That is higher stress and cortisol levels. That is shutting down and becoming hypervigilant. That's also people pleasing. It's behavior change, mental health problems. There's a much greater risk for children who are involved in domestic violence situations, even if they're not being abused themselves. This statistic also actually applies to children who are witnessing domestic violence. And that's a higher risk for anxiety and depression, PTSD, as well as other cognitive and behavioral issues. They can also develop learning disabilities from witnessing or being involved in abuse or domestic violence. Children definitely have a lower self-confidence, self-worth, and a high likelihood of a negative self-image. And we're going to talk about a little bit more in detail later why that is. And here again is what I mentioned before, depression and PTSD. They're also at a higher risk for aggressive behavior. They actually have been proven, there's been studies that show children that live in homes with domestic violence present have lower IQs and declined social abilities. So, this is my favorite part of the presentation, and I'm kind of going to describe why. So, this is what I created in my office at home as what I experienced as the generational cycle of abuse. I tried to describe this in the most simple terms as possible. But basically, when I was a kid, I witnessed and experienced domestic violence in my home. And into adolescence, I normalized that as behavior that's acceptable. And I was developing and establishing my self worth. So when I became a young adult, my low self worth and the normalization of conflict and violence in relationships spilled into my relationships, causing relational conflict. Eventually, when I became a parent, I had to overcome a lot of natural desires to want to be violent toward my daughter because that's all I knew as a display of parenting for me. So, we're going to dive into this a little bit more. But before I do, when I presented this cycle the very first time, it was for New Roots Family Facilitation, which is a company that is facilitates families who are going through litigation in the state of Texas for family law issues. So it could be adoption, divorce, separation, or child custody agreements. And basically, family facilitation helps with the ability for two family members to come together and learn how to communicate and actually put the child at the center of the goals. So while I was doing this seminar, and they hosted a seminar on domestic violence, and I was asked to speak and talk about my testimony because I knew the CEO of this company. And I made this graph, and I was the very first presenter because it was supposed to be a story that people would relate back to as the professionals started to present. And each one of the professionals had a similar, if not exact, cycle, just like this, in their presentation. And of course, some of the words were different. But I just felt that was really cool that these cycles and the professionals that are doing it are just humans like us. They just have pretty ways of putting it on paper and articulating that this is actually what's happening and this is what the data shows. So I decided to keep this, and I'd like to kind of go into more about what this cycle causes and why this cycle is so important. This cycle is on your workbook on page 6, and the descriptions that we're going to go over are on page 7. So during childhood, I feel like I need to ask a question. I really like engagement. This is my very first virtual event. So I'm like, how can I get people to engage some more? Y'all have been great so far. I really appreciate that. So during childhood, we are forming our core beliefs. We are way more vulnerable to physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. When any of those three elements occur during childhood, or abandonment and rejection, or constant criticism and shame, we bring those beliefs over into adolescence. If it's a constant expectation that it's normal to be rejected, or we use love as a weapon or a tool, like removing love as a tool of punishment, then as I'm growing into my adolescence, I'm going to believe that that is normal. If I become physically or sexually abused on a regular basis as a child, when I grow into adolescence, I'm going to believe that that is normal and that is how children should be treated. We all know here that that is the farthest thing from the truth. but this is how the brain works. The human brain is so adaptable. And as we witness and experience things, and we're trying to absorb everything about the world around us that we have just newly been introduced to, and it's all of these hateful and harmful things, then what are we going to expect on how to behave? So when we go into adolescence, we start normalizing and tolerating violence, and it solidifies our beliefs about what happened in childhood. Then we start acting out those behaviors, and then we're punished for acting out the behaviors that we were witnessing. So then you may, as a child, which is what I did, internalize those disagreements as I'm not worthy of doing what I'm seeing be done. And I'm also not worthy of trying it my own way. So I must not be worthy of anything. When you take those beliefs into young adulthood and you have new friendships and you have a lot more independent time and you have influence in relationships, you start to become the person that your parents are without even realizing it. And you hate your parents for who they are because of all the harm that they caused you. But there's such a lack of self-awareness at this age that this is when abuse typically starts in romantic relationships. I was actually reading an article the other day, and it said that teen dating violence is at the highest rate that it has ever been, um, during psychological studies. And I'm not surprised by this at all, considering all of the things that our teens are dealing with today with technology and just technology alone, guys. Come on, really? Um, it's insane. But when you add technology and all of those exposures and everything on top of what's on the top of the cycle here, it is so harmful, and the pressure is so put on that we have this perfect image and we need to be a certain way, and oh, she needs to be a certain way or he needs to be a certain way, and if it's not that way, then I'm going to get triggered and respond how I know how to respond, which is what I've witnessed at home. Or maybe I've just been abandoned and rejected. Maybe there was no physical abuse, but I was abandoned and rejected emotionally, and no one ever taught me how to cope with my big feelings. So even though I maybe didn't witness this, I don't know how to control my own. And so because I don't know how to control my own, I'm going to lash out or um, have self harming behavior, or I'm going to seek behavior that feels familiar, even if it's unhealthy for me. And then those relationships from young adulthood ultimately turn into parenthood. I didn't put marriage here. I didn't put, fluffy, happy go lucky, everything in the world is perfect and fine. I was, I became a parent outside of wedlock, and I have no problem admitting that because of the situation I was in and my ability to see now, looking back, at how much growth I needed to achieve before I actually felt valuable enough to not have to have sex with every dude that was tallest in the bar. Like, I hope someone's laughing. I can't hear anybody laughing. But seriously, that's kind of the mindset that I had when I was younger. And it was because I had low self esteem. I didn't see my worth. And I was constantly seeking something to fill me and to make me feel valuable. So when I became a parent and I didn't have a sense of self worth, I didn't have an identity now because I just went through all this trauma with my daughter's dad. I completely lost who I was. And in parenting, I realized that, oh, we have this cute little baby. She's so sweet. She's so cute. And then she starts growing and growing and trying to like stick her fingers in the sockets. and trying to electrocute and kill herself every 5 minutes. And now I'm a single mom working night shift, 12-hour shifts. I'm away from my daughter like 20 hours a day because I have to sleep. I've got a nanny who's like with my daughter for those 20 hours a day. And the 4 hours a day that I'm with my daughter, she's just trying to kill herself every 2 seconds. And I realized at that point in my daughter's life, I need to be more intentional about how I'm interacting with my daughter because I was reenacting my childhood experiences. I was spanking my like 9 month old baby because she was trying to stick her finger in light sockets. And I didn't have a lot of support or guidance from my parents because that's what they did. That's what they did. Right. So they would have spanked me to tell me that I was doing something wrong. But and I'm not an anti-spanking person. I believe there's a time and a place for whatever the parent feels is necessary for their child, and every parent has different values. But what I realized in my journey was spanking my daughter made her feel betrayed by me. And but that's all I knew. And so I had to be so intentional about how do I want my family to interact? What do we do in our family? What do I want my family moving forward to do? Do I want my daughter to respond this way? Do I want my daughter to get triggered and scream at her 9 month old? Do I want my daughter to do XYZ123 that I'm really struggling with right now? And I decided no. So in this cycle, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse. Yeah, I think so. Um, in this cycle, I had to break it right here, right now. I said, this is what we're not doing. We're not harming each other. We are going to love each other as best as we can. And we're going to make sure that we are always safe to make mistakes because that's an environment that I didn't have. I didn't have an environment that was safe to make mistakes. So when I talk about this cycle isn't just abuse. I later learned from the professionals that I was talking about earlier, this is drug abuse. This is spiritual abuse. This is alcohol abuse. This is um, child abuse. This is sexual abuse. This is all kinds of abuse. And I think the point that I really like to highlight at this point in the presentation is if you don't choose to change this issue, or if you don't choose to change your future, then that is going to be a task placed on your children. And I'll just let that one sink in for a minute. We're going to move on and talk about breaking the cycles. So, for those of you who have seen my presentation before, this is new, but I really wanted to make sure we incorporated this question. So, in the workbook, page 8, you can type out which cycles are you in right now, and how can you start or continue to break them? Maybe there are some that you hadn't realized. Maybe there are some that you have started with and you're at like a stopping point. You're like, I can't do anymore or I'm stuck. I love Christina's comment with it ends with us. I don't know if that's a show or a book, but I think I want to read it now. So Christina, please get with me after, and I'd like more information. So I just, and if someone's, thank you, Christina. If someone is brave enough to share a cycle that they're in right now and that they want to share and talk about, you know, where they're at in the process of breaking that cycle, I highly encourage that. Of course, it's a very vulnerable thing to talk about. But like Brene Brown says, vulnerability is the key to connection. And that's why I am brave. Before this, I'm going to be vulnerable for a second. before this presentation, I was telling Ricardo, I'm like, I'm anxious. I need to just smile or laugh about something. And because I've never done a virtual event before. All of the events I've ever done were in person. And he starts dancing and we're singing TLC and everything's fine. Right. But in the moment, it was just, oh, I'm about to do this. I have no idea what I'm doing because I've never done this before. And you know what? I did it scared. And my intentional work in my life and learning from Joe, we did have fun, Ricardo. Learning from Joe, learning from Amy, learning from amazing professionals who truly love people and want to see people succeed has been one of the most empowering things for me in my life. So if you want to do it scared and share which cycle you're in or what you're breaking, you can do that or share it with me afterward. At the very end, I'm going to share my phone number and my email address. I would love to hear from you and get a text from you. So, next, I want to talk about how I became a victim instead of an abuser. If you remember how the childhood impacts had, I'm sorry, words. If you remember when we talked about the impacts of domestic violence on children, it was a higher likelihood of them becoming a victim or an abuser themselves. Me, I became a victim. I definitely had some, what would you call it? Let's see what the slide says. I definitely had self confidence issues. I had a very low self worth. Um, it was something that has been a part of my existence, that I was never enough, that I, constantly was striving and striving and striving and never getting that affirmation from the people that I loved that I was doing enough. Um, I really love that Ricardo shared that he has been trying to set boundaries and saying no. Ah, recovering people pleasers in the house. Yes, we are. So, and Kimberly said the same thing, right? Setting boundaries was a bad thing as a child, and bringing that into adulthood ended up obviously not being healthy for her. But it's what we learn as a child that we bring into adulthood. And if we I really love that you shared that, both of you, because it does speak mountains. I think my mom personally struggles with boundaries right now, and I struggled with boundaries for a really long time too, until I had some really brave friends who were like, I think you could work on boundaries. And I'm like, I think you're right. How do I do that? So I another reason why I became a victim instead of an abuser is because I had a lack of discernment. And the people who didn't know this version of Daylan before all the healing occurred like 5 years ago, I'm currently described as someone who has a gift of discernment, which I think is so funny because I never had that gift before, and I believe I do have um, discernment now, but growing up, I did not have discernment at all. And so, with that lack of discernment, I was a horrible judge of character because I was constantly seeking what other people could affirm inside of me. And so I didn't see the red flags, or if I did see the red flags, I ignored them completely. Um, Roxy, I'm so proud of you for being brave and sharing your story. Roxy said, I lived in a house that was violent, quietly violent. We knew better than to say what was happening, probably because you were afraid of what would happen to you, right? And didn't say anything about it until both of my parents died. I was taught to suffer in silence. And I thought that that's what a relationship was. Wow. Roxy, that was extremely reflective and moving. It's so important that we have those realizations in our lives. And that's why I love talking about this. Because even though we can understand all of these things and then enhance our response and our empathy towards callers who are calling in as a girl, Girl, amen. 10K in therapy right here too. I've been in therapy for years. And it's the best. If y'all don't have a therapist, get one, because if you don't need one now, you're gonna need one later. That's a guarantee in this career. I don't know. I know there's a huge dynamic of different experience in this amazing conference this week, but if you have not ever heard someone say, if you don't have a therapist, get one, I trust me, if you seriously need to consider getting one, you're going to need to trust somebody at some point with your deepest, darkest secrets, because at some point it's going to come out in this career. So I was talking about, uh, I also had a realization earlier today watching another um, presenter that I think I'm neurodivergent. So we're just going to move on to the next point and see if we can spark my memory to what I was talking about. So I became a victim instead of an abuser because I was seeking confirmation of my value and emotional affirmation. And I also was refusing to be violent because of my mother's work. My mother was one of 5 children, and she was smack dab right in the middle. For some reason, her mother's violence and her alcoholism constantly came out at my mother. And so my mom was extremely physically abused as a child. Um, and so that helped her come into an adulthood. And she made that choice to not be an abuser of a parent. She said, I'm going to be the extreme opposite. Um, so she became a victim herself from my father, and but refused to be violent. She 100% refused to be violent. So it was by her breaking those cycles that I found eventually the power in me to break more cycles. And I commend my mama for that. So a huge question that people in the industry have, and I know that I had before I became a victim of domestic violence myself, is why would someone stay? Well, I'll tell you why I stayed, because I'm sure there's a lot of research, but I'll tell you why I stayed. I had an example of martyrdom and self-sacrifice from my mom. And so when I became a parent, I would try to stick around for my daughter. I also had this huge fear of having a split home and a fatherless child. Growing up in a split home was really, really difficult for me. Clearly, it impacted my ability to have discernment about men in my life. And so I never wanted that for my daughter. So I had this belief that we had to stay together. And so, because of that, I needed to be a martyr and I needed to sacrifice myself to give my daughter the best opportunity in life. Obviously, I ended up changing my mind, and that is completely false. If you are currently in a relationship and it's just for the kids and you are suffering silently, like I see going on in the comments right now, please ask yourself, is this the example of a relationship that I want to set for my child? Do I want my child to be treated like this? Do I want my child to treat other people this way? And just ponder on that. If you're following along in the workbook, we are on page 9. I also stayed in the relationship that was abusive because he was what people call a master manipulator. I was constantly blamed for things that he would do to me. You made me push you. You made me scratch you. You made me scream. You made me do this. You made me do that. And he was really convincing in his reasons because he was able to substantiate it in his mind. He was substantiating his actions in his mind and in his heart. So I was constantly being blamed for being abused. And I was also a 911 dispatcher. I had experienced all of these situations where I just felt for the caller. I heard the desperation in her voice. And then we send units out. They get out there and they arrest her. I'm like, oh shit, that was not at all like I expected it to be. Or what happened? Because I know in my soul that she's the victim in this situation. But he got or she got arrested. What is going on here? I've also seen situations where people cry out for help and they call 911. I drop a call, we get units en route, they're on scene, and then no one's arrested. And then that person has to live with that person that they're fearful of because there was no arrest made. So I was really concerned about losing my job. I'll tell you, I worked in a good center. Not gonna lie, during this time in my life, I worked at a really good center. The culture would be considered wonderful. However, there were stigmas in our center around domestic violence, and no one really, at that point in my career, had I heard someone addressing the stigmas about domestic violence. And because of that, I didn't feel safe bringing up my situation to my supervisor, to my friends at work. I just wanted to act like everything was okay because I didn't want to lose my job. I'm a kick ass dispatcher. I love what I do. This is my career. This is what I'm going to do forever. And I'm not going to let some idiot man take that away from me. Because if I lose my job and I'm pregnant with an abuser, then my situation is going to be even 10 times worse. So I'm just not going to say anything. So those are the reasons why I stayed. How did I end up breaking the cycle? So I want to kind of go through these comments. I think that it's amazing of how many people are brave enough right now to share the things that they're working through and the cycles that they're trying to break. The amount of bravery that we have in this industry is so powerful. And I feel like if we come together and support each other in talking about these hidden violent situations or these hidden abuser situations more often, then we will be absolutely unstoppable. We could really make an extreme change in this culture that we already that is already so tumultuous and stressful. So thank you so much again for being brave to share. I want to talk about how I started breaking the cycle and then move on because I really want to dig into the stigmas before we end here. So I decided that I wanted to leave because I didn't, if my daughter deserved a husband who treated her better than I'm being treated, then I should probably deserve better. And I would rather her have no example of a healthy relationship than a negative one and set expectations for her to be treated the way that she was treated. Um, Victoria, I'm really sorry to hear that this is a situation. Maybe you can talk about this situation with others in your dispatch center. Maybe meet with a sergeant and talk about potential options of how this um, situation can be supported by dispatchers who have strong beliefs about the harmful situations of domestic violence that are occurring. So I am back here again, neurodivergent. I self-diagnosed today, y'all. Okay. So we have a healthy example of relationships. I couldn't let my daughter ever be treated this way, the way I was being treated. And so I said, you know what? I'd rather do it alone and scared than stay here and let her believe that she deserves this. Um, and by the time my daughter was born, I had completely lost any sense of identity in myself. I had completely forgotten who I was. I lost my relationship with God 100%. I was living so far away from Him. I was completely isolated, and I had to figure out how to reclaim who I wanted to be. So I did that by defining love. I opened my Bible and I talked about, okay, what, like, I was so lost at that point and broken that I had nowhere else to turn, it felt like, other than to the one person that might have some control over my life, which was God, who I didn't have a deep relationship with at the time. So I was like, okay, God, what do I do? I have no idea where to go, what to be, who to be. What do I do? And so it was like, love. Okay, I know that I need to love my daughter, but I don't know how to love my daughter because I've not really had a great example of love for me in my life. So I had to define it. I spent a long time researching and reading and praying about what love was, and I listed it out. Like, I wrote it kind of like in high school, like those ISS, like in school suspension times where you have to like write down the things 100 times. I wrote down the definition of love like 100 times to try to etch it into my brain because that's what I wanted to be for my daughter. Once I defined what I wanted to be, I then had to become more self aware of like, where, how do I get there? How am I love? How do I be love for my daughter? And it was just by catching myself in those moments like, oh, I feel myself getting angry, or I just yelled. How do I become more aligned with my new definition of love? I had to grow my emotional intelligence. I did that through a mentor at work. That mentor, I believe, is here right now. So you know who you are. And I just want to thank you so much for being a part of that journey with me and growing my emotional intelligence and also growing my relationship with God, figuring out who He is, what He says about me, and what He's able to reassure in me that my value is. And then living intentionally, right? I feel like the majority of us, this world is just created to make us so busy that we just go with the flow. We just go with the flow. We just go one thing to another thing to another thing. We wake up, we get ready, we go to work, come home, pick up the kids, come home, make dinner, get ready, take a shower, go to sleep, and then we do it all over again. We're too busy to be intentional, but allowing ourselves to have permission, giving ourselves permission to slow down enough to say, let me think about this for a minute and I'll get back to you. Or I need 3 seconds to make a better decision because my reaction is not the type of response I want to have. If anyone has, I'm sure a lot of y'all have taken Joe Serio's class at the ranch or his any of his training courses, and he talks about living intentionally and like being consistent. Like that is something that is so important and it was so impactful in my life. And I did this before I met him, but now I'm realizing that his process is exactly what I implied here. Oh, that's really cool. That's a really cool realization that I just had in this moment. Also, finding my community. There are several people who are watching this presentation right now because I invited them and they wanted to support me and just be here. And they're a part of the community that God has given me. And I'm just so grateful because I can take something to them that I'm feeling sad about or unsure or insecure. And I'm like, guys, what do you think about this? Am I feeling crazy right now? Or are there things that I should consider that I haven't thought of? I just love my community. So, this is one of my favorite parts of my presentation because we're going to dig into this. And I've never done this virtually. Okay, guys? So, get your dispatch typing fingers out because we're going to race to see all of the answers that we can get. I'm going to time it for 1 minute because I really want to have enough time to get into the stigmas. So try to answer this question in the comments. Now you can copy and paste into your workbook because I think that will be helpful on page 10. But in the comments, I want you to write, what have you heard people say in the dispatch center about DV situations? Shannon says, why doesn't she leave? Yep, that's one that is always there. Why doesn't he or she leave? Come on, guys, dispatch fingers. Why is she still in this situation? Yep. And there's that word still. Obviously, that person has called multiple times. Crystal says, I wouldn't let that happen to me. Sonia says, they keep calling, but they don't want help. Hey, this camera thing is not focusing right. Um, they keep calling, but they don't want help. Come on, guys. If you think it's too crude, don't worry. I've heard the worst of the worst. So I promise you, there's nothing too crude to put in this chat because the more real we get, the more we can actually dig in to these stigmas. Obviously, they like it, right? They keep going back. So obviously, they like it. So why the hell am I going to help them? They're just wasting everybody's time. They'll be the first one here to come get his ass out of jail. Uh, why do we have to keep sending people to this? It's the same shit over and over and over. The protective order will not stop him from going to get this lady. It's just a piece of paper. Y'all, this is all so real. This happens, and these conversations are real in the dispatch center. If you have the ability to copy and paste that into your workbook, all those comments, and keep them in mind, because we're going to talk about some of the unspoken stigmas about domestic violence in public safety in general. Notice I didn't say dispatch because it's, I don't know what's going on with the camera. Clearly it's like not focusing. Okay, that seems to, the high five seemed to fix it every time. So, it's pretty crazy because our stigmas in the dispatch center usually just stay within our little circle of people who can hear us in the moment, but we're not the only people who think this. Law enforcement officers typically have it even worse. So we're going to talk about third party point of view and first party point of view. So from a third party point of view, victims, the belief is, and the stigma is that victims can easily leave their abusers. And if they don't leave, they must like getting hurt. They must like the abuse. Also, I don't know what's going on with this camera, y'all. Just focus on the presentation. Just look there. It's okay. Um, Another unspoken stigma is if it's not physical, then why are they calling for help? We are getting our asses kicked in here. I can't sit here on the phone with you for 15 minutes while there's a non-physical disturbance or an argument going on. It's not even an emergency. Last time they called, they just went right back there. If they choose to go back, then they don't want help. A first party point of view from a dispatcher's perspective, and these are things that I experienced thinking to myself, I'll never be a victim. Just like someone said, who was it? I wouldn't let that happen to me. Crystal said, I wouldn't let that happen to me. And my inner thoughts were, I'll never be a victim. And that ended up leading to my ability to be aware of my actual circumstances at home. And then when I finally accepted that it was happening, I said, well, it's happening to me. It's my fault. I got to get out of it by myself. And I also had the belief, right, that inner thoughts of victims aren't strong enough to get away. So if I'm not, admit that I'm a victim, then I'm not a strong person. So we're going to antidote this right now with the stigma versus the truth. And we're going to go third party to first party. So that first stigma that we talked about was victims can easily leave. And if they don't leave, then they're idiots or they like the abuse. But the truth is, leaving could mean that they become homeless ultimately because they lose their job, they lose that income, they're maybe a stay at home mom forever. And if they do leave, they don't have any money to take care of their kids, which means they're living in their car. If they get caught by police or CPS by living in their car, then they're going to lose their kids because they're in a financially distressing situation that doesn't allow them to take care of their kids. Who wants to lose their kids? Like nobody wants to lose their kids. I mean, let's say 99% of people don't want to lose their kids. Okay. All you dispatchers know exactly where I'm coming from. And if you're a counselor, you also know. So the other stigma that we talked about for third parties which is us in the dispatch center as dispatchers being involved in these situations, is if you're not being hurt physically, why are you calling? If you don't need help, and I'm not willing to help you because we're getting our asses kicked and I'm super busy, I don't have time for this right now. But we have to remember the elements that threat of harm is just as much domestic violence as harm, at least in the state of Texas. Also, a threat of harm can turn into actual physical domestic violence super quickly. And we all know that. I feel like everyone's trained about that. But when it comes down to it and we're feeling it, we're in survival mode at work, we forget about that. Another one of those, which is what a lot of us brought up in the comments, was last time they called, they just went right back. If they choose to go back, then they don't really want my help or they don't really need help. But I will tell you from personal experience that freedom from these types of situations takes time. You have to plan a financial plan. You have to get a job. When I decided to leave, I didn't have a job. I was in a stint where I decided to take time off from my career to have my baby and learn how to be a mom. And we moved from one state to another. And so I left my job and started applying and then stopped in the middle because I was like, oh, well, I just want to take some time and be a mom. And he's like, oh, yeah, cool, do that. And then never paid my bills. Um, so I lacked financial security when I decided to stop this situation, which then made it impossible for me to find childcare for a 5-week-old baby. Um, I didn't know how I was going to work 12-hour shifts and sleep and have a newborn. Um, and so I decided to try it. And through the grace of God and his amazing plan and the people around me at the time, I was able to figure it out. But when this isn't just me that this happens to, right? This is something that every domestic violence victim, whether man or woman, struggles with. They have to have financial security. They got to find childcare or find a school or enroll in school or take them out of the old school district and move them to the new school district. They got to figure out work schedule. And if they're in the process of planning this escape, they're still just as vulnerable to domestic violence. So then they call again. Let's talk about first party point of view. It's normally at this point in the presentation that I would have someone else start reading because I've been talking so much. But that's not a possibility on Crowdcast. Not a worry. Okay. My belief here was that I will never be a victim. So I was unable to see my actual circumstances when I was experiencing domestic violence. But the truth is, the ignorance of harmful behavior does not equal bliss. It equals things getting worse and then constantly making excuses for the people who are abusing me. This happened to me 100%, which is why I know that this is true. And so another belief was this has happened to me. I got to own it. It's my fault. I got to figure out how to get out by myself. I don't want to be a burden on anybody else. But someone else's lack of self control in a relationship is not your fault. I encourage anyone who knows someone or who is experiencing a situation like this to seek help because it is not your fault. Again, that stigma was if I admit that this happened to me, that I'm weak, right? But the strongest people struggle too and are often attacked harder than not strong people. So that the stigmas versus truth apparently were in the workbook, guys. So hopefully, if you need answers on those one, just send me an email. But now we're going to be on page 13. This is our last slide about what you can do about these domestic violence situations. And this can be in the dispatch center. This could be to break stigmas. This could be to have better caller care when it comes to understanding these situations. So, what can I do about this? Number one, remember why. Remember, I asked you at the very beginning to write it down, the why this is so important. I want you to remember why this is important the next time you get a call or the next time someone says, oh, I was in a fight with my boyfriend and I just don't know what to do. Can I talk to you about it? Remember why and just listen. Just be there for them. Also, remember the elements of domestic violence. Threats of harm are just as much classified as domestic violence and sometimes are its own charge, right? Threats of harm could be threats to another person, but if you're in a romantic relationship in some states, that's considered domestic violence. So make sure that you look up the elements of domestic violence in your state. Also, I ask for you to try to understand that the caller might feel stuck and they might actually be stuck. Maybe they don't know that they have to make a plan. They know they have to make a plan, but they have no idea what that plan consists of or how to even start to leave. And know that when the caller is calling, I'm going to get really emotional. When the caller is calling 911, that takes an extreme amount of courage for them. Um, Even though these situations are really difficult for us as dispatchers because they're sensitive in nature, they're really difficult to talk through. You hear a lot of crazy things. You know, there's probably higher priority things going on, but just know that the truth is this person who's calling you for the fifth time this month talking about the same thing is really, really brave. And it takes a lot of courage for them to call. Also, I want you to try to identify areas where you could improve with callers. In the workbook on page 13, I left a couple of blank sections so that you could kind of put those notes in there and do some self reflection. I want you to remember the generational cycle of abuse and understand that this is something that maybe their parents went through and the parents before them and their grandparents. Also, you can identify generational trauma in your life so that you can start healing. And once you start that process and you have that self reflection, it becomes so much easier to be empathetic towards people. I want you to listen for those stigmas, those trigger phrases that we talked about in the comments, and then do something about it, right? Say, say something. Say, hey, I wonder what makes us think that way. I talked about domestic violence. I went through this domestic violence presentation at this awesome conference I went to, and I learned a lot. Can I share that with you? Um, and I want you to support your people. Try to help to make work a safe environment. We can't make work a safe environment for our dispatchers who might be experiencing domestic violence if it's not safe to share and talk about the really hard things like, why do we say that they obviously like it? Why do we say that? That is so fucked up. Like, why do we say that? But we don't realize how fucked up it is when we're venting in the moment, right? So I really, really hope that y'all enjoyed this presentation. This is me and my beautiful daughter. There's my cell phone number and my email. That's also my Facebook link. You can get a hold of me via text, via email, give me a phone call. I probably won't answer your call because I'm a suspicious ass dispatcher who don't answer no calls that I don't know. But send me a text and then we can have a chat. Um, and at this point, I mean, my contact information is also in the workbook that I hope was really, really helpful for every single one of y'all. But I think that wraps it up. I know that we don't have much time left, but I do want to let you know that after this presentation, I encourage anyone, every single person here, if you know somebody or you are experiencing domestic violence in your life, please reach out to me. You'd be so surprised at how many people have reached out to me and they're experiencing that. And I can help them come up with a plan and walk through it so they don't feel so alone. So if that's you, please reach out to me and I'm here to support you.
Very well done, my friend. Oh,
I
man.
appreciate you.
Yes, that was great, and just so that you can see it right there in the bottom, Tina loved having an interactive workbook. Boom. There you go.
Yay, thanks, Tina.
I didn't put the poll in there for that because I figured you were
Why?
joking.
No, I was real. It was for real.
It was definitely cool to have that, and I'm gonna make sure to add that to the community as well, so that people have it on there when they go through the replays and everything else. Those links, everything in the chat will remain. So anyone who
Oh,
comes to
cool.
watch us in the replies, the chat, all of it on there stays there, as well as the poll and everything else. So, damn, well done. This is your first time doing it virtually, and you knocked it out. Well done. This is really good. And let's see, Roxy says, Dalen, this is wonderful. What a great presentation. I hope I can see it again in person sometime. And yes, in person, even more so. If you thought this was powerful here virtually, you got to see it in person because uh, I do it sometimes. There are other speakers who do it sometimes, but Dalen will walk through around with the audience and is like engaging and really in there and people engaging and talking and everything, and it's powerful and emotional and just awesome. Thank you.
It is. I apparently have like a special gift that makes everyone cry. I just make 911 dispatchers cry. And then we laugh and say stupid stuff like, yeah, he must be a kitty cat. And then I said, oh, yeah, you mean a pussy? You just didn't want to say it out loud. I
That's
don't know if
right.
anyone was at that presentation, but if you can, give me a whoop whoop, because that was probably one of the best instances of comedic relief that we had ever
Yes.
experienced.
That is, yeah, you are exactly right. I was sitting in the back and just like covering my mouth, just busting up laughing through that whole thing. And it
It
became a
was
thing
so
for
fun.
the rest of the time.
Yeah, it was so fun.
Yes, that was
Thanks for
excellent.
having me
So,
on, Ricardo. This was a blast.
of course, yes. No, like I said from the beginning, I knew I needed to have you on here to reach this audience and an audience from around the world. And everyone has got your information here. Please make sure to reach out to Dalen and connect. That's what this is all about, and support of this community. So, hell yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks,
Mhm.
y'all.
All right, everyone, we are going to be going to the last session of the day, day three. Holy moly, we're already at the end of day three. And the next
Mm,
session is called Imagine the Possible, and that's going to be with Brad Flanagan. And we're going to be starting that here in about 6 or so minutes. So we will see you all in the next one, everyone. Woo!
bye.